listening to, and I get exposed for listening to rap during a serious meeting. So I've been there. But hey, let's get this started off. Welcome to PowerShell Wednesdays. If you didn't know, every single Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, this very time, we are meeting for a PowerShell meetup where we have experts like Gilbert here today who talk to us about PowerShell. We got beginner topics, advanced topics, and everything in between. So if you listen to the PowerShell podcast, which is a weekly podcast I do every Monday, that's a great way to understand how to use PowerShell to change your career. But when you want to get down and dirty and see how things are actually done, that's what PowerShell Wednesdays are for. We got demos, we got code, we got questions. Ask them. If you are joining us on YouTube, thank you. This is our first time actually streaming to YouTube, which is cool because I can pull up your comments on screen and as I ask Gilbert. But Gilbert, today you're going to be talking about validating JSON and more. Can you give us a little rundown about what you're going to talk about and then take it away?
For sure. So I'm going to cover briefly a little bit about JSON, how you can use JSON in PowerShell. If you've never seen those commands, kind of walking you through that. A couple of tips and a couple of things that are important to note between PowerShell 5 and PowerShell 7. So Windows PowerShell and PowerShell. And from there, we'll move on to schemas. So I'll talk a little bit about JSON schemas, which is the thing I got excited enough to pivot from talking about Pester, because I really enjoy schemas. And then if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about JSON resume to kind of tie it all together and see it in action. I have a blog that I'll probably point to at the end. But yeah, well, we can talk about that when we get there.
Awesome. And I'll bring up your screen here so we can all see the loveliness that you've prepared for us. Boom.
Oh yeah. Also, this is the first time I'm going to use demo time, which is a really interesting project that allows you to kind of create demos in a repository. So let's see how this works. Cool. So we decided to call this, and by we I mean Andrew, decided to call this Validate JSON Like a Pro, which is like a much better title for this. Originally, I wanted to call it You Must Construct Additional JSONs.
I like that.
But maybe that reference might not click with everyone. So a little bit about myself. So my name is Gilbert Sanchez. If you see me online, you'll recognize me as Hey, it's Gilbert. I'm currently a staff development engineer at Tesla. I was known as the senior systems engineer while I was at Meta. I've also been referred to as Gitbert for my love of Git. But if you want to contact me, I have a links.gilbertsanchez.com, which is a little link site. That's a static generated site, which is a whole nother topic that one day I hopefully will cover on here, because I really enjoy static sites. And I think once you kind of get some foundations, especially like things like JSON, you'll start to kind of see the value in static sites. Hobbies, I like PowerShell, even on the weekends, much to my wife's dismay. I will find myself working on new modules or writing scripts. I also enjoy fishing, and behind me in a heap is a home lab that I'm also running, so I enjoy doing that. But you guys didn't join this to listen to me talk about myself, so let's actually get into the JSON. So why JSON? I would venture to guess that most of the audience is familiar with JSON because it's everywhere, right? It's the most common exchange format between the web, between processes. It's very common to find CLI tools that allow you to export your information as JSON. It's lightweight and human readable. So for most of you who were able to kind of read through that last slide, you were able to kind of see what I was trying to convey, right? You were able to easily take like name is Gilbert Sanchez and like understand that these two values are tied together. It's also language independent. JSON is actually comes from JavaScript, and it sort of started becoming the foundational way of exchanging information between APIs. So like often when you're working with an API, what you'll be doing is you'll be requesting information as JSON, or you'll actually be able to you'll be able to request information with JSON or retrieve it as JSON. And so with PowerShell, that allows you to get things like full objects back that you can kind of manipulate and use kind of for what you need. So let's add the PowerShell bit for PowerShell Wednesday. So with PowerShell, you can use commands such as convert to JSON, as well as convert from JSON. I'm a big fan of using hash tables because that's an easy way to convert to a JSON object. But dash as hash table is a PowerShell 7 only flag if you're converting from. That's just something to kind of note. If so I don't have the stream up to see comments, but if anybody has comments on, or if you can't read that, let me know, Andrew.
Maybe slightly bigger would be cool if you could.
Let's see if I can do that. No.
Nope. I mean, it's not too bad. I didn't see any complaints, and usually I'll be quick to see somebody say, zoom in, zoom in.
And the color, I mean, it's not great, but it's okay. Good news is I'll actually be walking through some examples, and you'll kind of see this in action. So at a high level, this is probably kind of the way you'll see it typically. So let's switch to this. It kind of helped. You'll see things like get content and maybe a JSON path, and then converting that from JSON. So maybe you have some JSON files on disks that you want to kind of read. Another common way, again, is from a HTTP REST endpoint where you want to go get something. In this example, I'm grabbing from an API that I found called Bacon Ipsum, which grabs you like lorem ipsum type content or text, but that talks about meat and bacon and stuff. So I thought that was kind of a funny one to use. So let's actually go into the demo. Cool. So let's switch these. I want this one over here, and I want this guy. Where did it? Over, Cool. So over here, I have my terminal, and I've opened up my demo file, and I'll share all these files after, so that way you guys can take a look. New. Shouldn't have put demo time down there. That was a bad idea with this zoom level. Okay, cool. So I mentioned using how did this move? That's weird. I mentioned using hash tables. So this is an example of a hash table where you have again something similar to my intro slide where we have a name and we have my evil twin Silbert Sanchez. And this is just kind of a basic hash table that allows you to kind of add data as you need. You can have strings, you can have ints, you can have more complex objects. And using the convert to JSON, we can actually output that to screen. So you can see that over here. We have where we created the hash, we converted it, and then we outputted it to screen. So again, if like at a quick glance you look at this, you'd almost say like, hey, this is the same thing. But one thing to note, like in PowerShell, you have equals. You notice that the keys are not surrounded in quotes, whereas in JSON, every string is surrounded in double quotes. Integers are still treated as integers, so there's no surrounding around it. And where hash tables in PowerShell don't require commas, JSON does. So something to note. And then you can, again, save that file out to disk. You can also read a file. So in this repository, I have a file called fruit.json, which contains a file that it says fruit is apple. We have size large, and the color is red. So let's say we wanted to read that from disk. We could just run this, and what we get is we have this get content raw, the JSON file, convert from JSON, and then we can see that this is an object. Now I'm going to do this a little different actually, and I'm going to do it as hash table. And I mentioned that this is actually my preferred way to do it because I often like to use the hash table methods to be able to kind of test things. So for example, this is a PowerShell custom object where you have the kind of the data structured, top to bottom. And this is more, because it's a hash table, a key value. So for me, I like to do things like contains key, and then I want to see like, hey, does this thing contain the key fruit? And then I can now get like a Boolean as to whether it has that key. So that's really helpful for when you're processing a lot of data and you want to make sure that the data is correct. And I'll touch a little bit more on correctness when we get to the schema section. But let's jump over to the API example. I don't know why it keeps making a new tab. So here we have the API example, very similar to what you saw in the slide. What we're going to do is we're going to call invoke REST method. We're going to say we're doing a get on this URL, and we expect the content type to be application JSON. So if we run this, Andrew, let me know if there's any questions also.
I have a quick question. Could
Sure.
you go into like that splatting thing you just mentioned a little bit? Because
Sure.
it looks like you have a hash table there, which I'm
Yes.
familiar with.
So yeah, so again, part of my love of hash tables is that you tend to see them in a lot of places, right? So this is a splat for invoke REST method. So I could have written this as method is get and oops, slide started jumping. Get, and then the URL is this. And now, but if you notice, like I haven't even added the other stuff, and it's like super long line. But I'm going to run a additional command, and this comes from if somebody can remind me the name of the module that exposes this, but I use this all the time. In fact, I have this as a shortcut, but I'm going to show you guys the long way. I have a command that allows me to take this existing like long line and then splat the command. And what it does is it creates this hash table, and you can use that hash table by using at and then the variable name. So this would fail, whereas this would work. And so it's a way to kind of take all your flags, all your parameters, and then kind of make a nice clean hash table. Another way I've used this in the past is where maybe you have the same set of commands multiple times, but then you just want to change like, hey, normally I'm doing the same URI, but sometimes I'm doing a method to the address, and sometimes I'm doing sometimes I'm doing a get, sometimes I'm doing a post. You can actually still combine these two in the same way, and the results are the same. Total tangent on splatting, but yeah. So did that make sense, Andrew?
Makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Cool. So yeah, this returned back a JSON object. Again, this is just like kind of silly text filler, right? So if you're working on something and you want to add text just to preview, it's just some silly examples. Cool. So I'll close this. So schemas. Let's switch over to. That didn't work the way I wanted. Let's just move this. We'll switch to it later. Cool. So schemas. This is the part I'm probably the most excited to talk about. I try to leverage schemas wherever I can. So I wish this was larger, but unfortunately.
Could you maybe close the terminal at the bottom?
Yeah, let me
make
hide
it better.
That kind of helps. How's that?
Looks good to me.
Okay, cool. So what about PowerShell data files, right? PowerShell data files are super useful in a lot of cases. I've seen a lot of really good use cases around internationalizing text, where you want to have something that takes the local language takes the local language and then formats the text in a certain way. There's a lot of similarities with JSON and PowerShell data files. They're just a little different. And my main gripe with PowerShell data files is that they don't have a schema. And I've used the word schema a couple of times. So I want to kind of clarify what that means. So a schema is a way to define how your data should be structured. When you talk about data, especially data coming into kind of central locations, having that data formatted in the way that you expect is super important. And what a schema does is it creates a contract between you and anybody else who's using your tool or your service or your endpoint, your APIs, and you say, if your data is formatted this way, we will accept it. And also, you can use this schema to validate that. Maybe you're using something to generate that object. You can actually say, okay, I have this object. I want to go make sure that it matches what it should. You can actually validate that. So this is a PowerShell 7 specific command, but it's a command called test-JSON. It takes a few different things. You can pass it a file path. You can pass it a string. So if you've already read the JSON off disk, you want to pass that in, you can actually pass it as a string. You can pass in a schema file, which we'll take a look at in a second, by putting it to the file path itself. Or you can actually have the schema as a string. So if you loaded the schema as a string and you want to pass that, you can do -schema. All right, let's hop over to I shouldn't have closed that terminal.
Can I kind of get caught up a little bit
Yeah.
on my end? Because I'm familiar
Yeah.
with JSON. I'm familiar with the concept of schemas. I've never worked with them directly. So I'm very curious to see what I can glean from this.
Yeah. So this wouldn't be a modern talk without talking about AI. So I'm going to show you guys how to AI LLMs are really, really, really good at generating schemas. And I'll show you guys an example of a schema in a second. But I just wanted to kind of take a look at this like JSON file, right? So I just threw this JSON file together, called it Gilbert. And let's say this is kind of a demo file that I'm like, you know what? I want all the users in my team, in our teams to have files like this. We're making a website or something. But right now, this is all free form, right? Like I can make this anything I want. So there's nothing about this that enforces that. So let's see if no, I lost it. It's okay. We can do this. So even better, I'll show you guys live. So I'm going to give this file as a context, and I'm going to ask Copilot, create a JSON schema for this file. I want the team field to be on enum, which only allows yellow, red, green, and blue. And then we ship that off to Copilot, and Copilot's able to kind of generate us a schema like super quick, right? I have a similar one already created, so let's just go and take a look at that. So this is very similar to what we just saw from Copilot. One thing to note is if you want to allow a schema, you want to make sure you add this property. And again, it describes sort of what this object should look like. You have your name, it's a string, you have an age, it's an integer. What's really interesting is that JSON schema has a lot of really handy features to allow you to do things like validation. So here we're saying that there is a minimum, and you can do things like maximums. So if I start typing in max, you can see that there's a ton of options. And you might be asking yourself, like, wait, how did I get all of this, right? Like, where did this come from? Like, how does VS Code just magically know this? It doesn't. It's actually coming from the JSON schema. So it's able to, again, now reinforce like anything that leverages JSON schemas has a schema to validate that the schema is good, right? So, here we said we want to some hobbies, and it's a string, right? It can be any hobby. And then we have our team where we said we want red, blue, green, yellow. So that kind of describes the properties of the object. Then you can do things like, hey, certain properties are required. Maybe we don't want to require hobbies, right? But we do need a name, an age, and a team. Or hey, you know what? Collecting age is there's HIPAA problems or something, some sort of compliance. You can't collect that. You might now we only require kind of name and team. Another thing I want to note is this additional properties. Um, additional properties being false means that only the properties defined here will work. So the question is, how do we leverage this, right? We have a bad team name here, but there's nothing here is telling me that something's wrong. But if we add the schema at the top, this can be a URL, this can be a reference to a file on disk, but now suddenly VS Code says, hey, wait a second, that's not a valid value. Like we only accept, these are the 3 teams. And so if I start to type again, VS Code using IntelliSense is actually able to figure out some of these things using the schema. So now we're going to say, okay, cool, we're on team green. Awesome. Cool. So that's leveraging a schema. You can generate it pretty easily with an LLM. Yeah, I mean, it's been phenomenal. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? We'll do another live thing. So schemas support in your properties, you can actually add descriptions. And you saw that kind of in here, this is a description. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Copilot to add a description to each field. And I've used this to great success. This has been really, really nice for things like, oh man, I got to go add some more helpful information or something that kind of explains what you would want to put into this. And Copilot has been able to kind of just quickly add in things like, hey, this should be a path URL to JSON schema, the age of the person in years, right? Like suddenly this is stuff that I don't have to add, that the LLM was very, very easy to kind of start to pick up and use. So if we take that, we close this, we don't need to save this. So this is great if you're looking at your JSON in VS Code, but what about using it somewhere else, right? Or let's say you're not opening up each file to see are there yellow squiggles? That doesn't work. And you want to take a look at a bunch of values. So in this folder, I have, hey, where'd my Andrew test go? But yeah, there it is. I created another one for Andrew. And then what I did was I wrote a PowerShell Pester test. So I'll kind of walk over this very quickly. If you haven't used Pester before, Pester has, this is going to be the crash course of Pester. So Pester has the idea of a discovery phase and a run phase. The discovery phase basically allows you to go get information about your runs so you can generate runs dynamically. So what this is doing is in our before discovery phase, we're going to say, hey, give me all the JSON files. And this is assuming the current directory. And then I want to say anything that space name is not schema, right? So the schema itself is a JSON file. So we don't want to scan that one. We know that one's fine. And so what we're going to do is for each of the JSON files. So again, this was the discovery phase. This is before it ever runs. It figures out, okay, how many files are there? For each one of those, I'm going to make a new set of tests. And we're going to use the name so that checking Gilbert.json. Here we're going to basically load up a bunch of information about the files, and then I'm going to kind of test. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the full name, I'm converting the file into a string. I'm grabbing that and passing that to convert from JSON, and then I want it as a hash table. The reason I want that as a hash table is I want to do the first thing. So I mentioned using hash table methods. I'm doing the contains key method, and I want to see, hey, does this have a schema? If the file doesn't have a schema, that actually might be the first thing I want to catch. Hey, this thing doesn't even have a schema. Maybe I should go at it. this defining a schema is not mandatory. But it is, again, very, very helpful, right? Especially when you open it in an IDE like VS Code.
Someone made a comment. This can also
Comment.
help you create comment-based help, or from the help, create the JSON schema as example.
Yeah. So you LLMs are really good at going either direction, right? With JSON, again, is a structured object. It's what makes it like so powerful, because you know that this isn't vague text that maybe that's the end of a line, but maybe not. Because it's structured, you're able to kind of LLMs do a very good job of going back and forth. So once we check to see, hey, does this thing have a valid schema? Cool. If it doesn't, the test will fail. If it does have a valid, next thing we want to do is we actually want to go back to the JSON string and we want to test it. We want to say, hey, that file you loaded, does it match the file, the schema that's defined in the file? So like, let's say, for example, you have multiple schemas, right? Maybe something describes, the teams. Maybe you have a team schema that has like a description of the teams and some information about when they meet or whatever. And then you have the people objects, and those are describing people. And again, in our example, we're pulling from disk, but this could actually be pulling from a website, or something else, right? Where you're kind of fetching the JSON kind of maybe from the web, a web. So what this is doing is, again, we're going to take the file on disk, the content, the string, and we're going to say, hey, is the schema that's defined in that file, does it pass it? Like, is it a correct schema? So let's go ahead and run this. You should have left. All right, we're just going to do it live. Cool. Yeah, so we're going to run the test. Cool. So what it did is it, again, does the discovery phase at the very beginning. It discovered that there are 4 tests, and then it starts to run the tests. From there, it found we're doing the people schema test, and the context is andrew.json. So I found a test file called andrew.json, and then the first test failed. We expected this to be true because JSON, andrew.json should have a schema property, but got false. So there's something wrong with that file. So now I can go look at that file and figure out what's going on. We look at Gilbert passed. He did all the right things. Sorry, Andrew.
That's all right. I'm used to it.
I should have done it the other way. Cool. So we're saying right now we open the file. What's wrong about this? We don't know. We can add the schema. What did I call it? Schema v2. Do yourself a favor. Don't name it generic like I did. Schema something is usually not very helpful. People schema is helpful. Versioning also is something to kind of keep in mind. That helps if you ever want to change your schema. So like maybe initially you're allowing, maybe you come up with a contract for V1, and then you want to make enough changes where the object is going to change, and maybe you make that a V2, and now you can say, hey, on this endpoint we're going to accept V1, but we're trying to move to V2. So like you talk to this endpoint instead if you want to do V2. So anyways, we take a look. Now that we have the schema, it says, hey, can't be Team Jacob. Got to be one of the other ones. So we Team Green's a valid one. So we switch over to Team Green. Now we're good. I think I got this right. I didn't know how old you were, Andrew. So I said you were 12.
That's about right.
So if we run this again, now you can see that all your tests pass. Now this is nice for 2 files, but imagine you have way more than 2 files, right? I didn't have to go and generate multiple instances of this to kind of get that tested. This is the beauty of the discovery phase, is that you can do that. But yeah. Any questions? Did I miss any comments?
I have some comments. Yes. So I just kind of want to follow along. So we learned some JSON commands in PowerShell. Then we learned about JSON, and they can have a schema, which I guess if you're creating something that requires input, you can define a JSON schema, or I guess the alternative is just to hope for the best and hope people curate things perfectly, which just does not happen at scale.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll work for you the first 3 times you use it, but then you'll make the mistake. So then you can create a JSON schema, and then in the JSON file, you can point to the schema, and then that will do some validation. And then with Pester, you can take the additional step to make sure that you are actually using schemas across all the JSON files in whatever project you have.
Correct.
And you can do further validation from there.
Yeah. So for example, like, let's say, most of my repositories are PowerShell related, but I have things that aren't. And you could still write a GitHub action that goes in and runs basically this test, right? Like, I just want to go check all the files in my repository that they're doing the right thing. So I'm just going to go and run this test. And that could be the only piece of PowerShell you wrote for that repository. This is, again, the part of the beauty of PowerShell is that allows you to kind of quickly come up with some of these things and then kind of run them. But it doesn't have to be in just a purely PowerShell, context.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that's the best approach. Like if you're going to set a standard, being able to enforce it and remind people is the only way you're going to actually get it if you're doing anything outside of just the immediate project you're working on.
Yeah, especially when you can imagine things like the process to generate the JSON to send or to receive takes a long time. Like, it would be better for them to validate on their end, like, hey, before I ever sent this to you, I know that it looks good on my end. So the failure must not be because of the JSON. The failure must be because of the underlying code, right? So something that you're doing on your end is not working the way we expected.
That's the best approach. If you want to do things the right way and learn a bunch of great technology along the way, that's definitely the approach to go for.
I was going to touch on JSON resumes, but I think we're on time. I can do the TLDR version. I can do the TLDR version. So if you were at PowerShell Summit this year, you may have seen me do a lightning demo. I was trying to figure out what to talk about at the PowerShell Summit, and I decided to do a talk on resumes and JSON, and like at a conference that's about PowerShell. And the talk and the demo had nothing to do with PowerShell. But again, what I want to show you is like PowerShell is actually really good at doing a lot of this stuff. So if we go to JSONresume.org, this is a standard that was created by some folks that allows you to define your resume as JSON. If we click on that, they have a schema that they've defined, and they give you sort of an example, right? So here is this basic site, and the basics key. This is an object, right? Like another hash table, where you have a name and your label, and a bunch of other things. And then you can do things like, hey, I've worked at this company, I've volunteered at these locations, here's my education. And again, a lot of these things, because they're like arrays, can actually have multiple values. And so I don't know if you've ever updated your resume between roles, and suddenly you have forever ago I wrote this in Word, and now when I open it, the formatting just looks wrong, right? Or I got to add more tables, and I got to reformat that, and the bullet points aren't quite right. What they have is a tool that takes that JSON and creates a website. Let me see if I can. They have a ton of themes, right? So because you're able to kind of abstract away the content and allow the tool to kind of plug in the theme, you don't actually have to go and make your theme or your resume look a certain way. You just have to provide the content. And for a lot of us, I think that's more what we care about. Maybe we're not designers. We just want to kind of fill in the data that's appropriate, and then just kind of go from there. So for example, like, nope, that didn't open. Oh yes, it did. So like this is the professional theme, and it takes again that same information and then fills this out, right? And so instead of having to do this over and over again, you can now do it once, update a single JSON file, and then whenever you need to make a new version, you can generate it or um, or have it update automatically doing a couple of things. And I talk about that in my blog, and that's probably more than we want to get into here. But
No, I think it's a really great example of a schema, right? Because if you're going to be creating a graphical thing like this at the end, you're going to need those properties, and it's defined in the schema. So it kind of prevents the person making the input, whoever is creating the resume, from going awry. And in that JSON file that you create that has your information at the top, don't know if I saw it in the example, but you can define the schema there, and then you get all the tab completion kind of stuff.
yeah, this is one of the funny things I thought I laughed when I first kind of looked at this, and I was like, oh yeah, they have a schema, and I'm like, bruh, you forgot to define it. So what I was gonna do is I was gonna show you guys, like, this is just, I took the basic I took that copy, I removed a bunch of information, I started adding email, right? And again, if I go and I start adding it by hand, like, I don't get anything good. But if I go and add this is the one that I never remember. I had that schema at the top, which again can be a reference to a URL. And so this is just pointing to their schema that they have on their GitHub. And I'm saying, hey, go grab the, off of master. I want the schema.json file. And now I can do stuff like, this, where I go back to sort of what it looks like. Now I can say, hey, I'm going to label is, staff, whatever, right? But then again, now you have a very easy to kind of work with tool that kind of guides you into the right direction.
Awesome. There is a question that I wanted to get your feedback on. It involves YAML, which is everyone's favorite, right? The tab thing. So this works well because schemas are built into the JSON spec, correct? I assume this can't be done with YAML without third-party tools. Was this something you ever looked into?
Yeah. So funny enough, I ran into this like a month or two ago, and I was talking to a team who was using YAML, and I was like, hey, I really like JSON because you can use a schema. And I thought to myself, I wonder if there's a YAML schema. You can actually, the answer is no, there is not a YAML schema because the schema is actually JSON. So this exact schema could be used to generate YAML files. I'm not as familiar with how you can have the IDE reference that or like kind of nudge you in the right direction with the IntelliSense. But yeah, it's the same schema. You would use the same schema there. So then the nice thing is I think YAML considers JSON a subset, so it should work, I think, for the most part. And I'm sure there's some nuance there that I'm probably not familiar with. But from my quick looking into it, I was able to just create a JSON schema and then again write a similar test where I say, hey, I have a bunch of JSON files. I want to take them, or sorry, I have a bunch of YAML files. I'm going to take each one and then validate it against the schema. Like if you're in this folder, you should validate with this. So that's the kind of thing you can do.
There's also a cool comment here from Ari, which is, it can reduce the amount of tests you do for each function parameters. If all the parameters are basically in one JSON file that is tests versus schema, this is very important when working with APIs.
Yeah. There's definitely a few ways to kind of approach that, right? So trying not to like the don't repeat yourself, this is one of those places where if you have the tooling in place to be able to work with a known good data, that's almost always when we can be successful.
Good tip. All right. Well, any last minute questions? We'll give them a second to filter in here, but quite a presentation. We covered a couple of things and I think introduced some really important concepts that people can start taking advantage of.
Yeah. My biggest thing is looking at the schema itself can be a little, it's a lot of, it looks like a lot, but once you start to look at it, actually, you realize it's actually not as difficult as you might think. And again, LLMs are really good at this. So like leverage them and have them write your schemas. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Gilbert, you've done it again. Thank you so much for joining us here on PowerShell Wednesday. And I believe I have a very special podcast with you and Stephen Judd tonight that'll be dropping on Monday, where we can maybe dive into a little bit more behind the scenes. I think we're going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of PowerShell. But if you liked PowerShell Wednesday, the recording will be up on YouTube. Actually, the live stream will just be converted into a video you can check out. Circle back. We have links that Gilbert talked about. I will include a link to his code, which we'll be posting here shortly. Join us every single PowerShell Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Let us know what you want to learn about in the future, and we can get awesome speakers, experts in the field to take you on a journey. Thanks, Gilbert, so much for joining us, and thank you, everybody out there, for watching.
Thank you.